So expanding this to the general elements of social preservation, or I should say system preservation, I think we can break it down to two dominant mechanisms: competition, and by extension, the philosophy of anti-entitlement. Competition, as we've talked at length before, including an interview with Alfie Cohen a number of podcasts back, I recommend people watch it. It's presented to us as natural and noble. And ultimately, it makes systemic inequality and structural violence appear normal as well, with these winners and losers that people expect as the natural order of things, making the existence of suffering that is, in effect, desired. And I mean that quite literally. The expectation of suffering makes it actually desired. This is the downstream sociological outcome, because you can't accept a competitive economic condition without the expectation of suffering, which makes the absence of suffering actually an immoral outcome in this worldview, as strange as that may sound. Now, as far as anti-entitlement, more importantly, we have this value that nothing should be provided and survival must be earned individually in a kind of abstracted form of compulsive, immediate reciprocity. And I want to dig into this a little bit more because it's fascinating. In early societies, as many anthropologists have studied, this was not a value. The Aikung San of Southern Africa, and I know I'm saying that wrong, it's spelled exclamation part K-U-N-G space S-A-N, they are noted for having a value structure based on giving without the expectation of return. Anthropologist Marshall Salins described this as a generalized reciprocity as opposed to balanced reciprocity or tit-for-tat exchanges. You know, at Christmas, when someone gives you a gift and they are disappointed to find that you forgot to get them one, or that sense of indebtedness you may feel when somebody does something simply kind for you and you feel like you now owe them something. This is clearly a side effect of market-based culture. Everything has become an exchange, even when money isn't involved. And you see it on many levels. The old "if it wasn't for me" phenomenon, and people are keeping tabs in a kind of mental ledger. And as natural as that sense of reciprocity and expectation may seem to many today, which does kind of symbolize the basic need for contribution and return that rests at the core of civilization, but not in this way. What we have instead is a neuroses. A neuroses that takes the common sense dynamic of general social reciprocity and distorts it into a singular exchange snapshot, reducing what is a systemic phenomenon to a contrived requirement of engagement in order to be entitled to anything. And it is that mental model that leads people to this "you must earn your living" phenomenon, discounting all the other dynamics that quite logically and rationally should facilitate a society that holistically takes care of itself without the need for perpetual direct exchange. Think about what we already are born into and get as a kind of societal inheritance that can't be stopped, really, rooted in the cumulative development of true wealth through the advancement of science, technology, design, and overall ingenuity. Ingenuity, which is a social process without exception, with influences coming into play that are almost impossible to separate. Thomas Edison was not the origin point of any of his inventions. That is a contrivance. He was an inflection point, part of an endless line of serially developed knowledge. He is a talented inflection point, but not the origin point. And on that basis alone, the contradiction is apparent. So you want a cell phone? Well then, if you're going to earn that cell phone, you need to develop the scientific knowledge from scratch yourself to arrive at that design and make it yourself before anything else. And no, you can't just say price is what determines this entitlement and brings it all into some intelligence, as theorists have tried to do. Price does not account for any of that, even though that is part of the propaganda. Likewise, you will notice that society as a whole does show pockets of moving toward a more with less pattern of economic efficiency, what Buckminster Fuller called ephemeralization, in some areas, even though it's done chaotically. The move toward zero marginal cost, as Jeremy Rifkin would say, is a thing, even though randomly amplified, but it is precisely the efficiency phenomenon that leads to the logic that society can operate without this labor for income structure and this contrived transactional reality. But that's not the system's incentive, of course, and which is why it doesn't actually flow outwards and become part of the system in a normalized way. Such outcomes are really anomalies because the society is not focused on the generation of cost abundance, so to speak, lowering cost to produce abundance, lowering cost not only in the sense of price, but the cost of actual labor, the actual input into something. The system can't function that way, as I've talked about before. It can only exploit scarcity overall in order to work, seek an infinite growth, as we'll talk about more so in a moment. So the zero marginal cost things that we do see are really true side effects. They're not features. They're fought, in fact, more than they are preserved. But those side effects are revealing the true potential that is being lost in terms of system function. Compounded, of course, once again, by the reductive propaganda that everyone has to engage in a transactional life at every turn in order to earn a living. A propaganda so profound that people consider it morally wrong for there to be any kind of true collective social provision or service to society that people do not engage in direct transactions for. It's mind-blowing when you really think about it. Even pseudo-radical yet common sense proposals that made it into the mainstream, like universal basic income, which is feasible as a stopgap to help the majority that's suffering without much disturbance to the system as a whole, it's ridiculed and dismissed. Remember when Andrew Yang ran for president on a platform of UBI? The idea was mocked as free money for lazy people, issued by the derisive nanny state, as if, once again, people don't actually already receive countless unearned benefits as a consequence of our basic material and design evolution. It's like one of those crude sociological studies you see with a person handing out free money on the street and people just walk by cynically assuming that it can't possibly be real or there's just something fundamentally wrong with the very idea. Put another way, imagine 10 people that work on a farm in equal capacity, each getting a tenth of the fruits of that farm as a collective. And then automation technology is developed, and it removes the need for any labor by those 10 people. Now those 10 people can use the automation and then get the fruits of the farm for essentially free. But then comes the market structure. And the source of that efficiency, whoever claims ownership in private property, decides that no, those 10 people have to now go out and get some other job in order to get the money to exchange for the fruits of that farm now, rather than getting direct support from the efficiency tool itself. This is the market pattern of sabotage we see. And again, what are we actually dealing with in this scenario? The source of that automation technology was most certainly not created in isolation. It's impossible. It embraces a long-term developmental process that is completely non-linear, serial. Hence, all technological innovation in the end has to be linked to a social source and not an individual or group source, which means society should get the fruits of what society ultimately creates. The whole idea of intellectual property here is what I'm really getting at, is an absurd contrivance, born entirely from the logic of market economics. It's needed within the system because the system has to have it. That's what the system is premised on. It's premised on property. The true dynamics and meaning of wealth creation in society are utterly lost. And yet the delusion prevails. What did Margaret Thatcher once declare? "There is no such thing as society," she said in 1987, fully entrenched in this kind of libertarian propaganda, chastising the idea that people should have any expectations from the larger order development of society, and that everyone can only look to themselves for bootstrapped improvement. This kind of thinking feeds into that old puritanical ethic of hard work. And there's nothing wrong with that ethic. It is certainly noble and important for everyone to be as self-sufficient as possible in a literal sense, expanding versatility in their own survival. But that is completely separate from the abject disregard the culture has absorbed from capitalism, where the very notion of social support as a consequence of the overall wealth created as a civilization that we all own, so to speak, is derided and dismissed. And so the culture drags along, essentially agreeing with the philosophy that creates their own oppression and deprivation once again, along with countless other related problems associated to the overall model of market economics and the sick values it supports. As I had my Simon character say in my film Into Reflections, the slaves don't want to be free. They want to be slave owners.